Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered why some things just stick in your mind and make you feel a certain way? This new research dives deep into how our feelings and likes get shaped. The world of psychology, and especially how we form attitudes, can get a bit complicated. Researchers have been trying to pin down something called evaluative conditioning for a long time. Think of it as learning to like or dislike something, because it has been paired with something else you already like or dislike. But what exactly is the effect they're measuring? That's the big question these authors, Olivier, Corneille, and Jérémy, Béna, are tackling. They wrote a paper, a preprint really, that suggested a new way to define this evaluative conditioning effect, or ECe for short. They felt the current definitions were a bit fuzzy and might be causing confusion. Now, another big name in the field, Jan de Houwer, has responded. And Corneille and Béna are writing back here to clarify their points and address de Houwer's thoughts. It's like a friendly academic debate. The main goal here is to get the conversation going in the research community. They want to make sure everyone is talking about the same thing when they say evaluative conditioning. They're not trying to pick a fight, but rather to sharpen our understanding of this important psychological process. The core of their argument starts with the problem they see in how ECe is defined. They believe the definitions have become heterogeneous, meaning there are too many different ways of explaining it. Sometimes it's seen as a change in valence, which just means how good or bad something feels. Other times it is about liking or a change in judgment, or even whether the change is seen as directional, meaning it goes in a specific direction of liking or disliking, or non-directional. They even mention definitions that include non-evaluative changes, which seems a bit counterintuitive if we're talking about evaluative conditioning. Now, de Houwer disagrees. He feels that ECe research is actually doing pretty well in terms of clarity compared to other areas. He points to how often a key article by himself from 2007 is cited, suggesting that most researchers follow that definition. But Corneille and Béna push back. They say that just because people cite the definition doesn't mean they all understand it the same way. They bring up de Houwer's own response, where he uses the word liking in 3 different ways, as a psychological idea, as an actual emotional response. And then, interestingly, as a covered behavior of a conscious feeling. This last one is a bit mind-bending. It's not the feeling itself, but the consciousness of that feeling. And if liking can mean so many things, it just proves their point about the confusion. They argue that if one particular understanding of liking requires participants to be consciously aware of their feelings, and perhaps even talk to themselves about those feelings mentally, then how do we measure that? They suggest that current indirect measurement methods, which are common in ECe research, might not actually capture this specific kind of covered behavior. They believe this highlights the need for clearer terms. Maybe instead of just liking, we should use attitude when we mean the general construct or evaluative response, or even specify conscious feeling of liking as a covert behavior if that is what we're measuring. Another point of contention is whether ECe effects should only be about general valence, the good or bad feelings. Corneille and Béna mention studies that seem to go beyond just good or bad. They cite research where, for example, face expressions of comfort or discomfort were paired with food, and the researchers looked at judgments about the food's healthiness. They argued that while healthiness is related to valence, it is a more specific meaning. They also point to another study that looked at features varying not only in valence but also in social relevance. They feel that sometimes researchers are conditioning specific meanings, not just general goodness or badness, and yet they still call it evaluative conditioning. This, they believe, blurs the line. They emphasize that conditioning a specific meaning like healthiness is different from conditioning a general valence, and that ECe research is at a crossroads where these are getting confused. This section gets into the philosophical side of psychology. A functional approach in behaviorism, for example, looks at the relationship between the environment and behavior. It is how they explain why we do what we do. De Houwer seems to be talking about a specific way to apply this. However, Corneille and Béna note that even within functional analysis, there are different ways to think about things. And not everyone agrees on studying covered behaviors, those private mental actions. They are a bit surprised that de Houwer seems to be presenting a very specific functional approach in his response, one that might not be widely adopted or even clearly articulated before. They feel that his new definition of ECe, which Hes introducing in his response, relies on assumptions that many researchers might not share or that address questions that aren't the main concern for a lot of ECe researchers. Here is a really important distinction they propose. They suggest defining ECe as a change on evaluative measures rather than a change in evaluations. What does that mean? Well, They argue that focusing on the measure the tool they use to see the effect brings them closer to a functional definition, because it separates the observed behavior from its assumed meaning. This also means that faked responses, people perhaps trying to guess what the researcher wants and answering accordingly, might actually be included. And they bring up a statistic suggesting that a significant portion of responses in ECe studies might be faked. If we're defining ECe by the measure itself, then faked responses on that measure could be part of the phenomenon, which has implications for how reliable past studies are. De Houwer suggests that the key is whether the measure functions in the same way, reacting similarly to changes in the environment, but Corneille and Béna argue this can be confusing. They point out that faked and non-faked answers on the liking question might both look like evaluations in the data, and truth and liking judgments can behave very similarly under certain experimental conditions. They address de Houwer's concern that their definition might not be very practical because it might include faked responses. They argue that if researchers are interested in understanding and controlling real-world behavior, they need to study all aspects, including why people might fake responses rather than just ignoring them. Corneille and Béna propose defining ECe directionally, meaning if you pair something neutral with something positive, the effect is that the neutral thing becomes more positive. They believe this needs to be distinguished from a contrastive effect, where the neutral thing might become less positive if paired with something extremely positive. De Houwer agrees that these assimilative and contrastive changes could be referred to separately. However, he doesn't fully agree with changing the core definition to be directional. Corneille and Béna find this odd. They argue that if we're distinguishing between physical and verbal pairings, or symbolic and non-symbolic ECe, and even covert versus overt behavior, then why not also distinguish the direction of the effect? They feel a non-directional definition lumps together two different outcomes, making it less precise. This section discusses how the key ingredient in ECe is the pairing of a conditioned stimulus, CS, and an unconditioned stimulus. As they bring up 3 points: the physical nature of pairings, their causal status, and their composition. First, they argue that ECe should specifically involve physical pairings, not just verbal information about a relationship. They note that de Houwer himself has changed his view on this, and now agrees that only physical pairings qualify. So, they question why he resists updating the definition to reflect this current agreement. Second, they discuss the causal status. This means we need to be sure that the pairing caused the change in feeling, and it wasn't just some other factor. They believe this is a crucial methodological requirement. De Houwer, however, seems a bit hesitant, noting the difficulty in determining when a procedure is suitable for testing ECe. Corneille and Béna see this as a general issue for ECe research, not a reason to change their proposed definition. Third, they talk about pairing composition. They think ECe is about pairs of stimuli. When you add a third element, like in a sentence, Mary loves Jenny, where Mary and Jenny are potentially the CS in us, and loves is the third element, it is no longer a simple pairing effect. While these triplet studies can be useful for understanding learning, they shouldn't be called ESE because the effect isn't solely based on a simple pair. Here, they discuss how de Houwer sees symbolic ECe, like learning from words, and non-symbolic ECe, like learning from direct sensory experiences, as different effects, not different mental processes. This means they react differently to environmental changes. Corneille and Béna admit they were a bit confused by this at first, thinking de Houwer implied different underlying brain mechanisms. They also bring up research that shows how a single event can involve both relational meaning and co-occurrence. For example, seeing brand X protect skin cancer might lead to different feelings than brand X causes healthy skin, even if in both cases the brand symbol is positive. They feel that describing this as two separate effects, symbolic and non-symbolic, is less straightforward than saying one effect was driven by two different internal processes. This is a fascinating historical point. The original interest in evaluative conditioning came from the idea that we could learn to like or dislike things, without cognition meaning, without conscious thought. They cite a study from 1957 that suggested this. Corneille and Béna themselves have researched this for years, and they find it odd that de Houwer seems to think they endorse a cognition-free view. They question the value of a cognition-loaded approach to ECe. If we're focused on how people draw inferences and make causal judgments, which is what a cognition-heavy approach might emphasize. They wonder if studying pairings in a psychology of pairings can really advance our understanding beyond what is already known in general cognitive psychology. They feel this area needs clearer answers. So, after this back and forth, what is the takeaway? Corneille and Béna believe there are some areas of agreement, but the disagreements touch on really important questions in ECe research. They still feel their proposed redefinition of ECe is valuable and offers a sensible alternative. They stress that researchers need to be aware that when they use terms like ECe Effect, attitude, or liking, they might actually mean very different things, including different underlying assumptions about how the mind works. They're concerned that if ECe research doesn't get its definitions straight, it could suffer the same problems attitude research has faced for decades with unclear concepts. They want the field to collectively rethink the core definition for the benefit of everyone. It's clear that this debate is important for the future of understanding how we learn to like and dislike things. Corneille and Béna are pushing for more precision, and while it's complex, it's really about making sure we're all on the same page when we study something as fundamental as our feelings about the world around us. It makes you think about all the little associations we make every day and how they build up our likes and dislikes. Pretty cool stuff. Right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think makes you like or dislike something? Is it just pairings or something more? And if you enjoyed this dive into the science of liking, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research breakdowns, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching.